Hi, I'm Laura and I'm here to deliver one of the tutorials that we're doing as a workshop for part of the Fife Art Exhibition 2020. I'm going to show you how to make a range of eco-friendly inks using a variety of fruit, vegetables, flowers, leaves, things that you might forage from your garden, things you might find in your kitchen, and stuff that you just generally find when you're out and about. You can use flowers, you can use weeds, you can use vegetables, you can use fruits, and a few other simple ingredients that you might happen to have at home. There's quite a lot of information, so the recipes for all of these inks are going to be on the website as a fact sheet you can download. The link will be underneath the video. So when you're choosing something, it's best to go for colours, something that has a really strong pigment to it. The inks that you produce are fairly watery, a bit like watercolours, and the stronger the colour of your plant, the stronger pigment you're going to get out of it. You can also get different colours from the same plant by using a different mordant. And our mordant is something that fixes colour and helps it to grab onto the paper. You can use different mordants to alter the pH of your ink, and that will give you a range of shades from the same plant. For example, this one are all from red cabbage with different mordants included. There are quite a few things you might already have at home that you can use as a mordant to fix your ink. These things include white vinegar. You've probably got that at home already, used for cleaning. You've also got things like salt, which is a very mild mordant. We've also can use bicarbonate of soda, which you might have at home for cooking as a raising agent. And you can also use washing soda, which has a very similar effect to bicarb, but much stronger. The other thing that you can purchase quite easily online is something called alum. Now, alum is a mineral powder and it's used in food processing and also in cosmetics, so it's non-toxic. It's also fairly cheap. I paid £2.50 for 100 grams from eBay. And they're really useful for adjusting the pH as well as fixing the ink. So you can see here I've got 4 samples all made from red cabbage, and I've got different shades here by using different mordants. Now, the bicarbonate of soda I've tried at different levels here. That one on the darker green has more of the bicarb. So the bicarbonate of soda will make things more alkaline and shift more towards the blues and greens. Acid mordants like vinegar or alum will move more towards the purples and reds. But you will get different reactions from different plants, so it's worth experimenting a little bit there. There are some plants which don't actually need the use of a mordant to make them fix onto the fabric or the paper, but it will make them more light fast. And some interesting ones of those are tea, which is a very easy and basic one. You can just make up some strong tea, reduce it down gently over some heat in a saucepan if you want to make it more concentrated. I added some salt to mine to help preserve it. And preservatives are important because natural inks will go bad after a while, so it's quite useful to have a preservative or use them up very quickly. Another interesting one of my favourites, is avocados. Now, the creamy flesh in an avocado, once you get rid of that and you're left with the skins and the pips, what you want to do is scrub them clean, get as much of the green flesh off as you can. You want to chop up your stone into small pieces, and you can already see the colour change happening in this stone because it's oxidising in the air. If you simmer your chopped up avocado stones and your skins into a pan, you can add your mordant in and you can adjust the colour using a mordant, and you get a really lovely rich ink which goes through shades of reds, browns and sort of pinky colours. Other things you can use to make inks without using a mordant are spices such as turmeric. Turmeric gives a really lovely, beautiful, bright yellow that looks quite pale when you put it on the paper, but as it dries, it intensifies. You can also adjust the colour of your turmeric using a mordant. And it's worth trying out some other spices. I haven't tried them yet. Turmeric's the only one that I've tried so far. Onion skins do make a lovely colour. I've used brown onion skins here, but you can also try red onion skins and see what colour you get from that. Right, there are 2 basic methods you can use to make ink from your plant materials. The first one, that's really simple. You just take a glass jar. Now, this is a really good method for using for fairly delicate soft material like rose petals. You can use leaves, grass cuttings, weed from the garden, anything like that. So you put your plant material in your jar, squash it down a bit. I sprinkled some salt in with mine while I was doing that because that will help act as a preservative to fix your colour. You then want to pour hot water just off the boil, just enough to cover your rose petals or whatever you're using. You then want to give it a good shake and leave it sitting in a warm place, perhaps a sunny windowsill, at least overnight, and a bit longer if you can manage it. Once it's been sitting there, you can check on the progress of your colour using a paper strip. But you need to be aware that your colour is going to change as it dries. So this is just to give you a rough idea of the intensity of the colour. So I'm going to take a strip of watercolour paper and dip it into the liquid in my jar. Let it soak for a moment. And you can see we've got a kind of pinkish colour appearing there. It looks quite pale at the moment, but you'll notice as it dries, and here's one I dipped earlier on, that as it dries it's gone quite a lovely shade of purple, and it's also got a little bit darker where it's pooled on the end. Now we're going to make the colour a bit more intense when we strain it, and also when we come to using it as a paint we'll have added a couple of other ingredients. So this is ready to strain now, and I'll show you how we do that. So you want to get yourself a nice clean glass jar. You're not going to need a very big one because you've got a fairly small quantity of ink. So I'm going to use a funnel just to make it a bit easier. You then want to filter your material through either a piece of cloth that has a fairly tight weave. You can also use something like a J cloth, cleaning cloth. You can also use coffee filters. You're really just squeezing out the liquid from the rose petals and then filtering out any bits of rose that come through. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to carefully tip my liquid and my petals into the funnel. And you can see that lovely colour coming through there. And what you can do just to help it through, you can squeeze the liquid very carefully through. And you can see that colour coming out there. And there we go, there's your basic ink, and it smells lovely by the way, wish we had smell-o-vision here. So there's your jar of ink. Now you might find if you still think that's very watery, what you can do is pop that into a small saucepan, heat it very, very gently on the low heat for a while, and it will gradually reduce down and thicken up. The next step is to just make sure it lasts as long as we like. So I'm going to say I have already added some salt. There are other ingredients that I can add as a preservative, and in this instance I'm going to use some isopropyl alcohol. And I'll talk a little bit more about preservatives in a moment, but I'm just going to add a tiny drop to my ink. It doesn't have to be a lot, just a little dribble. And the other ingredient I'm going to add is something called gum arabic. Now gum arabic is available as a powder or a liquid. Lot easier to use the liquid so you don't have to dissolve it from yourself. You can get this from art suppliers, lots of them sell it. I bought mine online. I think this was about £4.50 for a bottle that size. Again, you don't need very much, so you're just going to add a couple of drops, and that is going to improve the consistency of your ink and help it stick to the page. Once you've done that, my next suggestion is you're going to want to label your ink. So what I like to do is write on a piece of paper what my ink is, and then I place a bit of the ink next to it and allow that to dry. I'm then going to sellotape that to the side of the jar, and it means an easy reference. So when you're working with them, as you can see there with the avocado one, it gives you a reference of the dried colour to refer to when you're using the paint, because they change as they're drying. The second method of making ink I'm going to talk about is good for tougher materials such as vegetables like beetroot, which gives a beautiful red colour. You can use red cabbage, which gives you a whole range of different colours depending on which mordant you use. And one of my favourites is avocados. All you need to do is chop up the vegetables you're using, place them in your pan. Your ratio of water is roughly a cup of vegetable to about 3/4 of a cup of water, but I'll put more details about that in the fact sheet that you can download from the link after the video. You add in your water and your vegetables and your mordant and heat very gently, bring it up to just below boiling point. You can do that with a lid on to speed it up, and the vegetables will cook down. Once they're kind of cooked down into the water, you can take the lid off and cook with it off for a while to help concentrate it. Add your mordants very carefully and start off with a really small amount. You can then test your ink by dipping a strip of watercolor paper or other absorbent paper in. You can then, once it's dry, assess the colour and see if you would like to add some more of your mordant to adjust the colour. And you can see here I have a whole range of colours which are made using different mordants or the same mordant at different concentrations with red cabbage. For example, this fairly khaki-ish green here had about a teaspoon of bicarb, whereas the more blue tealy kind of version here only had about half a teaspoon or less. So go carefully with your mordant, adjust and test as you go until you like the colour that you have. One of my favourites is avocado ink. I'll show you an example of a piece done with avocado ink, and it gives you this beautiful range of pinky browns and sort of sepia tones. You will find it varies a lot with individual avocados. Each one you use will give you a slightly different colour, and you can adjust the colour, I said before, by using a different mordant. The one I've used here has a washing soda in it, which is a fairly strong alkaline mordant, and that will kind of give you these lovely sort of pinky colours. To make my avocado ink, what I did is I used the skins very thoroughly cleaned. You want to wash away as much of the flesh as you can from the avocado, because the flesh will make your ink more cloudy and it'll kind of dilute the colour. So, and your stone, although it gives it, you cut it open and it's a creamy colour, you can already see with sitting out into the air, it's producing these lovely russet browns as it's oxidising in the air. And what we're going to do is we're going to drive that chemical change and produce more of these reddy tones. So I put my skins and my avocado pips from 2 avocados into the pan. I added about 3/4 cup of hot water, and I heated it very gently on the stove for around about 20 minutes to half an hour, then checked it to see if I liked the colour. It was quite a good colour by then. So I turned it off, leave it to cool down. Once you've got it cool, you can then strain it exactly as we did for the rose petals into a jar through a filter. And you can then add, if you want to add extra preservatives and your gum arabic, then that's when you do that. Again, it can be quite pale, but you will be able to reduce it down and get quite a concentrated colour for avocado skins. They do have natural tannin in them, so you don't necessarily have to use a mordant, but if you do, your colour will be more light fast. Now, as we mentioned before, natural inks will have a much shorter shelf life than the kind of paints you buy. It's a good idea, if you can, to store them out of direct sunlight. If you do have any opaque containers you can put your ink in, that's a great idea. Coloured glass or a solid plastic will work. The other thing you can do to preserve their life is keep them in the fridge. And there are a couple of preservatives you can add to your inks to keep them more for storage. So vinegar acts as a preservative, as does salt. If you want something a little bit stronger, you can try using a couple of drops of essential oils. Thyme oil is a very powerful antiseptic and preservative. You only need a couple of drops. You can also try other essential oils such as lavender or tea tree. The other thing that people sometimes do is drop a clove into the jar, and the clove contains phenols which will act as a preservative. The other thing that you can use is an additive into your ink is gum arabic, which we mentioned before. It's not essential, but it will improve the consistency of your ink and it will spread a little better and it will adhere to the page better. If you do any watercolour at home, you may well already have some of this. It's something a lot of people that use watercolour have in their kit. It affects the way the paint flows, and it's really useful for doing wet on wet effects because it will preserve it will slow down the drying of the water, and you will have slightly longer for the paint to move through your wet page. Again, gum arabic, not terribly expensive, about £4.50 from any art suppliers, and you can get it online if you don't have access to an art supply shop. Now we've got some examples here of artwork done using my homemade inks, and you can kind of see from the colours and texture you get here that they're very similar to watercolours. So that means you can use the same techniques that you're used to using with watercolour. I really like the wet on wet effects you get from these, and doing some monochromes meant I get to really enjoy the colour and I only make my first ink. So the first one I did was the blackberries, which is a very easy one to make. And I really like the colour. It changes dramatically as it dries, so that's a really interesting one. So you can also use the sort of dry brushing techniques. You can use the salt sprinkling effect, which gives you this really lovely sort of textured blooms through your watercolours. And it spreads beautifully, and especially if you wet your page first with some water with a touch of gum arabic, and that will slow down the drying and it will help the ink to spread. You can start building up your collection of inks, and then once you've got a range, you can kind of start using them much as you would your illustration inks or your watercolours. I particularly like using them kind of line and wash effect, because it's a lovely way to highlight the colours in a drawing, and I think they suit botanical drawings particularly well because of the earthy quality of the colours. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a little demonstration of a wet on wet watercolour technique, and it'll also give me a chance to show you how much the colours change as they dry. As you can see here, I've done a really simple mountain landscape using a wet on wet watercolour technique, and I'm using the red cabbage with alum because I really love this misty blue colour. The lines that I've done already you can see are dry, so you can see the final colour of the paint. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add another layer onto it, and then you'll be able to see the difference between the colours. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to turn that round for a moment so I can work this way. The first thing you want to do is you want to decide roughly where your mountain line is going to be on the landscape. You're then going to wet the paper. Use yourself a fairly large soft brush. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to use water that has a tiny bit of gum arabic added to it, and I'm just doing that to slow down the drying ever so slightly. You might not need to do this if you can work fairly quickly, so don't worry if you don't have any gum arabic. You still have got time to do a very simple line here. So some water with just a tiny touch of my gum arabic, and I'm going to plan out where my mountain line is going to go very roughly, and from the top edge down to the rest of the bottom of the page I'm going to wet the page, and you want to put plenty of water on so that your page is nice and wet, and this is going to allow your colours to bleed and move, and you'll get these really nice wet on wet watercolour effects. So that's nice and wet. So next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to get a pointed brush. I quite like these, they're almost like the Chinese style brushes. They hold a reasonable amount of paint, but you get a nice fine tip. So I'm going to load up my brush, and I'm going to draw in the top edge of my mountain. And as I do so, you can see what a difference there is in the colour between that and the dried parts of the painting, and you can begin to see how that paint is beginning to spread out, and you can add more and watch it spread. You can actually, when it's really wet and with a gum arabic, you get these beautiful little tendrils forming. It's almost like a sort of a mocha diffusion technique that you get in pottery, and you can keep adding more ink and adjusting your mountain line until you're happy with that. You can also, if you want to, tip the page slightly and the ink will run down, and you can kind of see, add a bit more in there, you can get these lovely abstract effects. You can also see here what a beautiful intense purple that is, but it does dry to this lovely misty blue. There we go, it's a very simple mountain landscape. I've added in a few little birds here, but you can maybe add a few more details, some trees perhaps, and some other features in the landscape, but just keeping it really simple and enjoying the beautiful wet on wet watercolour effects you can get with your homemade inks. Once your masterpiece is dry, you do need to remember that it's not as light fast as it would be as if it were made with commercial paints, so you can either scan it or photograph it and keep it for posterity, or just store it out of direct sunlight. You can get frames that have UV proof glass in them, so if you have something you really want to put on display, that's an option as well. But I hope you use these for all sorts of things. Enjoy making your homemade inks. They're certainly a great thing to use for Christmas cards and other things that don't need to last a long time. Different inks will have different levels of light fastness, and I haven't made any long enough ago to fully test them, but I'm sure you'll enjoy doing your own experiments, and we'd be interested to see what you've made. Thank you very much.